Hello again. My name is Andy Nicol, and this is lesson 23 on the Perfectly Spoken Advanced course. In lesson 23, we are going to be looking at non-defining relative clauses. In lesson 21, we looked at defining relative clauses. So in this lesson, we're going to be building on that and looking at the following. Comparing and contrasting defining and non-defining relative clauses. And then we'll also be looking briefly at what we call reduced relative clauses. Reduced relative clauses to make our English writing more concise, etc. Okay, so non-defining relative clauses then. What do we mean by them? A non-defining relative clause gives us additional information about something which is not essential. Remember, with defining relative clauses, it was essential information we were looking at. Here it's additional information. So here's a couple of examples. My sister, who lives in Scotland, has 2 children. Is A, and B, my sister, who lives in Scotland, has 2 children. So, what is the difference between these 2 sentences? Well, sentence A, the implication is that I have several sisters, but I am referring specifically to my sister who lives in Scotland. This is identifying, it's telling us which sister we are talking about. So the implication is I've got several sisters. In my case, I do actually. I've got 4, in fact. And then B, the implication is that I have only one sister who happens to live in Scotland. This is just additional information. The main information is that she has 2 children. I'm just saying, oh, by the way, she lives in Scotland. So it's additional information. And we can notice in sentence B that we use commas to separate the relative clause from the other main clause. We can also use a comma and a full stop if it's at the end of a sentence. He never hands in his his homework on time, which is quite infuriating. It's quite annoying. He never hands in his homework on time, comma, which is quite infuriating. Okay, the main information is he never hands in his homework on time. The fact that's infuriating is just some additional information. Okay, some more points to make. Remember, with defining relative clauses, we can replace who or which with that. And especially in spoken English, we use that a lot. But in non-defining relative clauses, it's not possible. We cannot use that. Also remember, in defining relative clauses, we can leave out the relative pronoun who, which, etc., where the relative clause refers to the to the object of the sentence. But with non-defining relative clauses, it's not possible. We'll look at some examples later to practice this. We can use of which or of whom or of whose after quantifiers, a few, a little, a lot, and superlatives. The mountains, the highest of which is Ben Nevis, are known as Munros. This is referring to, in Scotland, we have in the Scottish Highlands lots of mountains over 3,000 feet, I think it is. It's about 1.7 kilometers or so, 1,700 meters or something like that. These are known as Munros after a famous climber who gives them that name. So the mountains, the highest of which is Ben Nevis, this is additional information, are known as Munros, the highest, of course, being the superlative. So we can use of which after a superlative. We also use of which, of whom, of though, of whose, sorry, after both, enough, some, any, few, etc. The children, many of whom are orphans, desperately need our help. The children, many of whom are orphans, desperately need our help. So, can we correct the following mistakes? First one, the Guggenheim Museum, which was designed by Frank Gehry, is in Bilbao. And there's a little picture of it there. If I disappear, you should be able to see it. The Guggenheim Museum, which was designed by Frank Gehry, is in Bilbao. Well, obviously, we've said the Guggenheim Museum, so there's no need to identify it here. This is a non-identifying or non-defining relative clause. So it should be the Guggenheim Museum, comma, which was designed by Frank Gehry, is in Bilbao. Up here again. Number 2, my brother David, that lives in London, is an architect. Okay, thinking back to the rules that we looked at before, my brother David, that lives in London, is an architect. Of course, in non-defining relative clauses, we cannot use that. So it should be my brother David, who lives in London, is an architect. My brother David, who lives in London, is an architect. Okay, let's have a look at the next sentence then. So I asked Peter, I had told about the accident for some advice. Oops, I'm going to disappear so you can see this. I asked Peter, I had told about the accident for some advice. What is the matter with this sentence? What's the mistake? See if you can pause the recording if you need time to think. And it's, I asked Peter who I had told about the accident for some advice. Remember that in non-defining relative clauses, we cannot omit the pronoun. We can't drop it, okay? So we have to use who in this case or which. Okay. The runners, many whom were suffering from dehydration, all finished the race. The runners, many whom were suffering from dehydration, all finished the race. But of course, after many, a few, several, etc., it's of whom, or of which, or whatever. So we need the preposition of. The runners, many of whom were suffering from dehydration, all finished the race. They're obviously doing a long marathon or whatever. Okay, my grandmother, whom lives in Bath, has just celebrated her 96th birthday. So what do we think is wrong with the sentence? Pause the recording if you need time to think, obviously. And it's my grandmother, who lives in Bath, has just celebrated her 96th birthday. Remember, whom comes after a preposition. The new skyscrapers in London, the highest for which is the Shard, make for a spectacular skyline. I was just in London over Christmas, and there's a fantastic skyline, a combination of the very old architecture, St. Paul's Cathedral, Palace of Westminster, but now you have these huge skyscrapers which are dominating the skyline. The highest is the Shard, and of course it's the highest of which is the Shard. So the new skyscraper in London, the highest of which is the Shard, make for a spectacular skyline. Okay, so let's try and put some sentences together. Obviously, relative clauses, we use them when we're combining essentially two sentences into one, just with non-defining, just with defining. So here's an example. And this is the British Museum in London. Again, I visited this with my daughter most recently over Christmas. She was really impressed with the Egyptian mummies and so on. Unfortunately, many of them robbed in the 19th century from Egypt, but they have returned a lot of the artifacts now to Egypt. Anyway, by Saturday, we had visited all the museums. Saturday was the last day of our trip. So how can we combine these two sentences into one using a non-defining relative clause? Okay, so pause the recording if you need some time. And here is the answer. By Saturday, which was the last day of our trip, we had visited all the museums. Remember, we cannot drop the relative pronoun in non-defining relative clauses. And remember, we use commas to separate the clause. Okay, next one. Okay, here you have a businessman looking at some high-tech monitors. And here's the sentence. My brother David is very successful. He is an entrepreneur. Well, this is actually invented. I don't have a brother David. But anyway, my brother David is very successful. He is an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is a person who creates new businesses out of nothing, and so on. It's from French, actually, which is why the pronunciation is a bit strange, entrepreneur. So, my brother David is very successful, he's an entrepreneur. How can we combine these two sentences together? Pause the recording, obviously, if you need some time to think about it. And the answer is, my brother David, who is an entrepreneur, is very successful. Okay, here's another one. Okay, so here we have some firefighters. This is in Greece, I think, from the writing. And here are the two sentences. The firefighters are on strike. That means they have stopped working to protest about something. Many of them are angry about government cuts. Okay, so thinking back to the rules that we looked at, how can you combine these two sentences together? Think about the word many here. And the answer is the firefighters, many of whom are angry about government cuts, are on strike. Firefighters, many, after many, we use of, and after preposition, we use whom for people. So many of whom are angry about government cuts are on strike. This is very common nowadays, with particularly in countries like Greece, which are suffering very badly from the cuts, the austerity that's been taking place. Okay, next one. Okay, we have a picture of a very high-spec flat or apartment if you're an American. The difference between British and American English, flat in British English, apartment in American English, and the two sentences are, these luxury flats or apartments are currently on sale. Many of them have underfloor heating. So how can we combine these two sentences together? Pause the recording here if you need some time to think about it. And here is the answer. These luxury flats, many of which obviously, because flats are things, many of which have underfloor heating, are currently on sale. Okay, here's another one. Okay, so we've got a picture of somebody with their feet up on some textbooks, chemistry, physics, maths. My teacher suggested that I study chemistry, physics, and maths. I don't like any of them. My teacher suggested that I study chemistry, physics, and maths. I don't like any of them. How could we combine these two sentences together using a relative clause? Again, pause the recording here if you need some time to think about it. And here is my suggested answer. My teacher suggested that I study chemistry, physics, and maths, comma, none of which I like. Okay? Which, obviously, because they are subjects, they're things, and after none we use of, none of which I like. Okay? Actually, I quite liked those. So I liked chemistry and physics, at least at school. Maths, okay, so. But anyway, let's move on. So, that's non-defining relative clauses. A stylistic tool we use in English when we're writing in order to make our language more concise and therefore have a greater impact on the reader, we use what we call reduced relative clauses. We shorten the clause and we omit certain words. It's a form of what we call ellipsis. Ellipsis simply means where we leave out words. We don't use all the words from the full grammatical sentence. Okay, so in terms of reduced relative clauses, let's have a look at this. We can use a participle clause instead of a relative clause to make writing more concise. If it's an active sentence, okay, where you have subject, a verb, etc., we use the present participle. So we use the verb plus ing. Here's an example. So here's the full relative clause separated by the commas. The children who are working as chimney sweeps are beautifully depicted. This is referring to a novel from the 19th century, for example. Charles Dickens, it could be. In the 19th century in Victorian England, it was common for children to work. And one of the jobs they were given often was to clean chimneys above the fire, and they were sent up the chimney with a brush and to try and clean the chimney. So they were called chimney sweeps. It weren't only children, there were adults as well, but children often were employed doing this in Victorian Britain. So the children who are working as chimney sweeps are beautifully depicted. The children working as chimney sweeps are beautifully depicted. So we just use the verb plus ing instead of the full relative clause. Okay, next one. For passive structures, so this is for active, we use verb plus ing, what we call the present participle. For passive structures, we use the past participle. Obviously, this is verb plus ed if it's regular. If it's irregular, there's the famous third column in your list of irregular verbs. So here's an example. The novel, which is set in London in the 19th century, is a classic. So we remove the relative pronoun and the verb to be. The novel set in London in the 19th century is a classic. Okay, so let's look at some examples and see if we can make these sentences more concise. I'm sticking to the theme of films, books, etc., which is one of the genres where it's very often used for reviews and so on of films and books. Anyway, here we go. Spartacus, who is played by Kirk Douglas, is crucified at the end of the film. I don't know if you've seen the film Spartacus, very famous epic film set in Roman times when the slave Spartacus led a rebellion against the Roman army and defeated them on many occasions before he was eventually defeated and then killed. So crucified obviously is put on a cross to die. So how do we make this more succinct? Of course, Spartacus, played by Kirk Douglas, is crucified at the end of the film. So we use the past participle. Okay, next one. The novel, which is set in medieval England, was an international bestseller. I was thinking of something like Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth or something like that. The novel, which is set in medieval England, was an international bestseller. To make this more concise, we take out the relative pronoun and auxiliary verb. The novel set in medieval England was an international bestseller. Okay, for the next one, I'm going to disappear so you can see it well. The film, which was directed by Quentin Tarantino, tells the story of an ex-assassin, someone who you pay money for to kill, who is looking for revenge. Well, here there's actually two places where we can use the reduced relative clause. Pause the recording if you need time to think here. So we could say the film, directed by Quentin Tarantino, tells the story of an ex-assassin looking for revenge. So we've shortened which was directed to directed, and who is looking for revenge to looking for revenge. You can also change the order a bit of the sentence. You put things up front to give them more emphasis. So you could say, directed by Quentin Tarantino, the film tells the story of an assassin looking for revenge, and so on. So you can change the order to add emphasis and so on. Okay, so that's all for today's lesson on non-defining relative clauses, comparing them with defining, and looking at reduced relative clauses briefly. Okay, so in the next lesson, so will be lesson 24, we're going to look at vocabulary, and we're looking at expressions related to the brain and mind. There is a little example there for you. This is a brain which has packed its suitcase and going away. This is something which is quite common these days because of the economic climate. People, academics, business people, people with skills travel to other countries in order to find work. My own sister-in-law, for example, is an architect, had to move to the UK because there was no work for her here in Spain. And this is called a brain drain. A brain drain is where academics, intellectuals, professionals, etc., leave a country looking for work elsewhere because of either the political or economic situation. Okay, so brain drain. So in this lesson, we'll be looking at expressions with brain and mind, and also at idiomatic expressions with brain and mind. I'll make this will become clearer in the lesson itself. Okay, so thank you very much for tuning in to today's lesson. I hope you found it useful, and I hope that you can tune in again to the next lesson on the brain and the mind. Thank you so much, and take care. Bye-bye for now.